Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, welcome. I probably don't need the microphone, but I will use it. Maybe it's helpful for recording. My name is Karen Palasek. I'm Dr. Palasek. I'm attached to the Department of Management here at Methodist, and this is my first full semester here as a permanent faculty member, so I'm very happy to be here. I'm introducing today the initial event sponsored by the Center for Entrepreneurship, and Dr. Dobra is in charge of the center. This event is designed to be a panel discussion, and a panel discussion of a particular concept that was inspired by an article by Malcolm Gladwell that appeared in the New Yorker magazine, yes. So I think it's appeared in more than that, but anyway, the discussion of the article was based on a study of residents from New Orleans who escaped from Hurricane Katrina and were permanently displaced. And the thrust of the article was that after 10 years, many of them were better off, that had actually experienced a great deal of income mobility in cities outside of New Orleans. So the thrust of the article in discussing income mobility said that of all the places that the folks who could have been displaced were from, only one city other than New Orleans offered worse prospects for income mobility, and that was Fayetteville, North Carolina. So obviously, this opens up some possibilities for different perspectives on that kind of discussion. So the point of this discussion is really not to debate or decide whether the author is correct, but to just give some lenses and perspectives from different folks around the university on what they think of that concept. And in that line, the Center for Entrepreneurship would like to promote this sort of environment of entrepreneurial understanding of markets, incentives, and ideas around the Fayetteville area. So the discussion today will be moderated by Brenda Mitchell, and she will be introducing the speakers and holding forth with Q&A afterward. And the only other thing that we're asking, I think, is that by the time we're done, you fill in the survey, the email survey sheet that you were given so that we can get some feedback on this. A little bit about our moderator. Brenda has a lot of experience in the areas of applied communication, debate, and speech. She has completed a Master of Arts in Educational Technology, has a Bachelor of Science in Education from Central Michigan University. She's been very, very successful in coaching and conducting webinars for debate coaches for the National Speech and Debate Association. So I will let Brenda take over and do what she's going to do for this session.
All right, hello everybody. As this nice young lady said, my name is Brenda Mitchell. I'm briefly going to introduce our panelists for you, just so you guys have a feel of their background, and then we're going to get started with the discussion right away. So first off, we have Matt Dobra. He holds a PhD and a Master's in Economics from George Mason University. He also has a graduate certificate in higher education from Monash University and a bachelor's in history from Loyola University in New Orleans, which is interesting because that is kind of where this article, most of it is talking about in New Orleans. So he's currently an associate professor of economics, chair of the Department of Financial Economics and Entrepreneurship, and the head of the Center for Entrepreneurship in the Reeves School of Business at Methodist University. So lastly, his primary research interests lie in the fields of resource economics, public economics, and political economy. Next, we have Regina Smartin. She holds a PhD in sociology and a master's in sociology and a master's in education from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a bachelor's in anthropology from Syracuse University. Currently at Methodist, she is an associate professor of sociology, the chair of sociology department at Methodist University, and her primary research includes the sociology of childhood, medical sociology, and sociology of education. And last on the panel, we have Robin Jenkins. He holds a PhD in psychology and public administration from North Carolina State University, a master's degree in clinical psychology from East Carolina University. And his career has been a mix of applied psychology, criminal, juvenile justice practices, and teaching. So before he came to Methodist, he was the Chief Deputy Secretary and the Chief Operating Officer for the North Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and also the former Executive Director of Cumberland County Communicare. He is currently an Assistant Professor of Justice Studies here at Methodist University. So as you can see, we have a wide range of backgrounds here. So it should be very interesting, and we're going to get started right away with Matthew.
Thank you very much. I assume this works. Fantastic. So first of all, thank you all for coming to this event. I convened it in hopes that maybe we can all learn something from each other about Fayetteville, but also income mobility and how it relates to our city. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the economics of income mobility, and especially to try to ground us in what we mean by the concept of income mobility, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. The first thing we should make clear is that when we talk about income mobility, typically speaking, we're talking about what we call intergenerational income mobility, not intragenerational income mobility. Intragenerational income mobility refers to the idea of what happens to people throughout their life cycle. And it turns out that there's a whole lot of intragenerational mobility. If you just look at our students, right, they're going to graduate from our university, and they're going to be poor for a little while because coming out of college, jobs don't pay a whole lot. And then once they get into their 40s and 50s, they're going to be some of the, the more well-off people in society. And then they're going to retire. But people don't retire right away. They sort of whittle down their working hours. They go from working 40, 50 hours a week to working 20 hours a week, to working part-time. And so we see this sort of, this rise and fall of incomes over the life cycle of the normal human life. But this isn't really what we worry about when we talk about income mobility. That's something that that's how life is. What we're more concerned about is the idea of intergenerational income mobility. And what that refers to is the idea of if you are born into a rich household, or if you're born into a poor household, especially the poor ones, what is the likelihood that you are going to not be poor yourself when you're an adult, right? And so these are very long-run statistics. These are things that we look at over a very long time horizon. Most of the research that's been going on right now looks at IRS records from like the 1980s and matches it up to the IRS records of their kids today. So we're talking about a really long-run phenomenon. And it turns out that one of the phenomena that people are starting to notice today especially is that intergenerational mobility is highly dependent on the places where one grows up, right? Intergenerational mobility is not something we can just sort of talk about, America has it or America doesn't have it. America has it, but in very different levels across the country. You can look at, say, heat maps of intergenerational income mobility. The South, just across the board, has very low levels of income mobility. The Midwest has very high levels of income mobility. Out West, there's a bit more of a patchwork pattern out there. But we can see some very clear regional trends in income mobility. Now, the second thing we ought to talk about is the distinction between relative and absolute income mobility. And this is a super important concept that sort of escapes a lot of people. When we're talking about the poor, the way we usually talk about the poor is that we sort of assume that we can line everybody up in the country from poorest to richest, right? Just like when you're in third grade for picture day, you line up from shortest to tallest. Right, we're lining up from lowest income to highest income. And then we're going to take that line of people, we're going to break it up into equal-sized groups. And sometimes we break it up into 4 equal-sized groups and we call those quartiles. We break it up into 5 equal-sized groups and we call those quintiles. And usually we're talking about either quartiles or quintiles, all right? When we're talking about the question of absolute income mobility for the poor, we're typically saying, all right, let's take the people in the bottom quintile, right? The people in the bottom 20% of the population, and ask the question, how well off are their kids going to be relative to the parents themselves in 35 years, right? So if you're born into a poor family in 1980, how well off are you going to be as compared to your parents? And that's the idea of absolute mobility, comparing you to your parents. Most of the time, we don't actually worry about this number because it turns out that most of the time in free market capitalist societies, that just happens, right? That just sort of automatically happens. There's this sort of notion out there that the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. We don't really see that in the real world. We tend to see that the rich get richer and the poor get richer, not necessarily at the same pace, but the poor do tend to get richer over time. And so maybe we don't worry about that so much, although towards the end of my 7 minutes, I might say we should worry about that in Fayetteville. But the other one that we mostly talk about is the idea of relative mobility. And relative mobility says, all right, if you're born into this poor quintile, what is the likelihood that you are going to jump out of that quintile as an adult, right? So not income relative to your parents, but income relative to everybody else. This is how we usually view it. Personally, I think there's a bit of a moral or values problem. I know Regina will tell you I have no morals or values because I'm an economist, but I think there's definitely a moral or value issue here, because when we're talking about people moving out of the bottom quintile and into the next best quintile, by definition, somebody has to replace them, right? And so, you know, maybe you have this idea of, oh, the poor move out into the richest quintile, and then Miley Cyrus is going to wind up poor someday. And I'll admit to feeling a little bit of schadenfreude about that. Yes, right? But that's not really what we're talking about, right? It's not really the rich dropping down from the top quintile all the way down to the bottom. It's okay, one person's kids, you know, from the very poor group becomes working poor, but somebody from the working poor is replacing them. And so we have, you know, a problem that's just sort of moving around at that point. We don't have a problem being fixed. So my perspective is that what we really should be concerned about is not relative mobility, and I'm guessing that these two will both disagree with that, but we really should be concerned more with absolute mobility. And it turns out that if you look at the data in Fayetteville's not only bad at income relative mobility, it's bad at absolute mobility as well. So looking at some of the research that's done, the research in the paper that Gladwell cites from the New Yorker talks about states. But there's some other people who are doing research at the county level data. And if you look at county level data, it turns out that there's 3,000 some odd counties in the United States. Cumberland County is, I want to say, 12th worst in terms of absolute income mobility for the poor. But it's also in the bottom 1% for income mobility in absolute terms for the middle class. And it's also in the bottom 2% of absolute income mobility for the rich. And by rich here, we're defining that as the bottom quartile versus the top quartile, or yes, quartile, so 4 of them, right? So people who are born in that 75th percentile, right? So that would be in Fayetteville roughly $70,000 to $80,000 per year of family income. They tend to have very low levels of absolute mobility as well. And so what I think we have going on, less than simply a problem of mobility, is a problem of there's something dysfunctional about the Fayetteville economy that's not allowing growth to happen across the board. Now, what are these problems? And I know I'm running out of time, so if you want to hit me with more questions about these when it's Q&A time, please do. But I think we can really boil the problems down to 2 or 3 big ones. First is that Fayetteville has a very high level of poverty to begin with. And when you have very high levels of poverty, that creates problems. One of the problems that it creates is it incentivizes crime, right? When you are very poor, crime is a very viable way of earning money, right? And so that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is that Fayetteville's in the South. And the South has a few problems associated with that. Among those would be things that are very bad for income mobility, such as family stability. Family stability tends to be very low in Fayetteville. We have a whole lot of single-parent households. We also have, I have one more. High teenage pregnancy, good for us, fantastic. Thank you, Regina. But another problem that we really have is, and I know it's completely wrong to say this, but the military is not necessarily helping our economy. It forces the economy to become under-diversified. And if you look at the data across, if you compare what all right, my last comment. If you compare the makeup of our workforce in Fayetteville versus the makeup of the workforce around the United States, there's some very clear trends. Fayetteville has a whole lot more people in the education sector, a whole lot more people in the medical sector, a whole lot more people in the food service sector, a lot of sort of low-level retail. But what all of these things have in common is that these are not areas that drive productivity growth. And if you don't have productivity growth, you're not going to have wage growth, right? And the only one of those that looks like it might have productivity growth is healthcare. But most of the productivity growth in healthcare is not coming from the service side. It's coming from the manufacturing side or the production side. So, time's up.
All right. Thank you so much. Now we'll have our word from Christina.
Okay. Is this working? Yes. Okay, I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to read something to you. But on the bright side, I'm going to disagree with Dr. Dobra, the economist, on many points, which will be much more entertaining for you than if I hadn't organized my thoughts. So as the lone sociologist, I want to start with the bigger picture. And in the big picture, the gap between the rich and the poor in the U.S. has been growing for decades. This is apparent even when we are looking at relative measures. The top and the bottom quintiles remain stubbornly and notoriously sticky in the U.S. Over time, this has been true. When we look at absolute measures using dollar signs, the shrinking of the middle class is only more terrifying. As a sociologist, I'm sad to report that the American dream is really a dream. I'm also sad to report that available data does not suggest that fixing income mobility at the state or local level, even if it were possible, can fix the gap between the rich and the poor, or vice versa. It is not cost-effective to try to apply basic research that is inconclusive and unsupported by empirical data to policy issues and a locally specific problem. So here I'm going to disagree with Gladwell. The only solution in my mind is to restoring the American dream is to restore the middle class in order to improve neighborhoods. Hope to convince you that a lot of very good research on how to address child poverty already exists, which is what I see the problem being. I hope to also convince you that social mobility research is not a good vehicle for decision-making about diversifying the local economy that has a very specific trajectory that has led to almost total dependence on the military. I think Malcolm Gladwell is at best half right about what social science can offer us in terms of insight into problems and solutions. Furthermore, I think Fayetteville has been wrongly singled out as the worst place to be born in America. Or, to be frank, I see Malcolm Gladwell's take on the contribution of social science as flawed. He is at least overstating his point, and to a degree misinterpreting social science. His use of Fayetteville as a rhetorical device to describe income immobility can only be described as unfortunate. Gladwell seems oblivious to the contextual reality of being a military mega-based metropolis that has expanded like mad since the 1960s. In truth, our metro commuting zone would not have been large enough to make the top 100 list in the past. Right, top 100 list of largest commuting zones, which is where this data is being drawn from. I do not take seriously the charge that Fayetteville is the worst place to be born into the bottom quintile in America. Fayetteville is not anywhere close to the poverty level of many small rural places in America. It makes more sense to think of the Fayetteville metro area as only slightly worse than the nation as a whole, although perhaps more economically vulnerable because of our dependence on the gun belt industries, including, of course, the Army. Now that I've told you what Gladwell has gotten wrong, I should hasten to note that he does get something right. He has zeroed in on the message social science is trying to get out about neighborhood effects, and these effects are particularly harsh, at least this is my read, for children under 13. We have good data on this. This is real. Child poverty is the indicator that I believe we ought to be paying attention to. We are a rich country with a ridiculously high child poverty rate, by some measures the highest in the industrialized world. Even if the child poverty rate in Cumberland County is just shy of the national average, or slightly more than the national average, I should say, this is a problem because the national average is about 1/4 of American children living in poverty, and the rate seems to be growing. The national child poverty rate has worsened since 2008, and it is higher today than it was during the Great Depression. I can say the same thing about teenage pregnancy and the divorce rate. Even if Cumberland County is a tad more than the national rate, the national average is the highest in the industrialized world for both teen pregnancy and divorce rates. Although the teen pregnancy rate and the divorce rate have improved somewhat, It's hard to get excited about this, knowing that we're still the highest in the industrialized world. I think we should be very concerned about the effects of resource-poor neighborhoods on poor children. I think we should ask ourselves why countries less wealthy than us do a better job of prioritizing the welfare of children. Many Americans may be surprised to learn that social scientists have been measuring what we call the Great Gatsby curve for some time. This is the empirically supported hypothesis that relatively unequal countries tend to have less economic mobility. You heard me right, the US has less economic mobility than other countries, many of them, and this trend is apparent across time. This phenomenon is harder to study at the state level, and my reading of the analysis of economists Chetty and Hendren, who are cited in Gladwell, is that this is not significant at the level of commuting zones either. This is partly due to the fact that state-by-state differences tend to be much smaller than country-by-country comparisons. In short, I think Gladwell is throwing Fayetteville under the bus for rhetorical effect. His point about neighborhood effects gets lost in a discussion about good and bad cities and rankings of cities and rankings about mobility and numbers. In truth, America is not a good country to be born in, poor, because we do not prioritize neighborhoods, children, or parents. One does not need to know how to calculate the Gini coefficient to understand that child poverty is a problem worth addressing. Although relocation experiments prove that neighborhood effects are real, this does not mean that relocation is the answer for large populations of children in poverty. Cumberland County is the 4th largest school district in North Carolina. More than 50% of its students receive free and reduced lunch. This means more than half our students live within 130% of the poverty line, and that's a lot of kids. Reshaping neighborhoods and structural features is not cheap. Here, social science may be of some help in the form of evaluation and policy research. This research can guide sensitive budget decisions. We should start by looking at successful programs that have measurable effects, but we should not assume that we know how social stratification works in the American context. As I have emphasized, Gladwell gives social science more predictive certainty than we, the social scientists, are comfortable with. However, studying interventions is still a knowledge-producing endeavor. For example, and I am wrapping up and I'm going to run over just a little. For example, the Smart Start program in North Carolina produced measurable results in terms of outcomes for children and saved the state of North Carolina a lot of money. It turns out that addressing particular types of disability at the pre-K stage reduces the number of children identified for special education services later in elementary school and improves educational outcomes for those students. There have been a series of data analyses to try to unpack what worked across the state of Cumberland County, and this data has been fed back into policy recommendations for the legislature. We need to do a similar cost-benefit analysis when we're looking at Medicaid expansion. And did I mention Medicaid expansion? Year-round schooling, reforming our juvenile justice system, school-based health clinics, universal pre-K, expanding more at 4, and infusing more readiness curriculum into existing child care programs. Here I mean academic content. And did I mention Medicaid expansion? Specifically, there is a need to look at how military families on Fort Bragg are accessing early interventions through the Strong Beginnings program as we move forward. And I don't think there's any data on that yet, but I'm sure our next speaker will have something to say about that. So do not misunderstand me. Nothing is more important than sustainable economic development that raises the median household income, about $43,000 in Cumberland County, for families, and housing values, which are about $120,000 in Cumberland County. To me, the American dream is restoring the middle class to its former glory so that we can create healthy, sustainable neighborhoods. The house we live in is the traditional means that the middle class passes down wealth to their children. Housing values are key to economic development in Fayetteville. It is obvious that Fayetteville needs to diversify its economy. It is less obvious how to do this, and I assumed that my esteemed colleague in economics and entrepreneurship would have many ideas. So you can direct all of your questions about this issue to him. It is clear that to everybody that overdependence on the gun belt is unsustainable. It is worth repeating that neighborhood effects are real and that they hit children under 13 the hardest. Cumberland County should keep all the options on the table with regards to economic development, and the county should prioritize research-tested programs that have been proven to work for children in poverty, especially young children. We should pursue and accept federal, state, private, and nonprofit money with or without strings attached, but we should carefully track the results of these interventions These investments will pay dividends as long as we are careful stewards of our resources. I believe any economic development plan will take time, and failing to address the needs of children in poverty in the meantime is a dangerous choice that will feed the cycle of violent neighborhoods. I'm sorry I ran over.
All right, thank you, Regina. And then our last speaker today is Robin.
Well, thanks to everybody. This doesn't sound too loud, maybe too close. Thank you, Dr. Dobra and the Center for hosting this event. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate and be among you. And there are many things that have already been said that I'm going to agree with, so I won't rehash them in my comments. I think Gladwell's article gives us an opportunity to sort of take our own pulse about Fayetteville, North Carolina. I pretty much grew up here. I have a long history of social and policy interactions in the community. And so thinking about what Gladwell says and writes and the data that he gets his information from causes me to pause and think about how much of this is sort of within our span of control and what we can do to influence locally versus state versus federal policy. And it's an important conversation. It's really hard to do all this in 7 minutes, so I'll try to give you the cliff notes. It's also important to realize that Gladwell got his data from social mobility studies that are going on at Harvard and part of something called the Equality of Opportunity Project. They've looked at 2 birth cohorts, one in the 50s and one in the 70s, and basically determined that income mobility is about the same at the same rates, even though there are differences obviously in real dollars and how wages have grown over the course of those years. The reality, though, of course, is that the wage spiral has not kept pace with the sort of cost of living across the country in various quintiles. And so there are wider and wider gaps in wages that are available to families across the spectrum. And of course, those that are good at earning wages suffer less with that problem than those that are not. Capitalism creates winners and losers. And in our country, we are creating winners and accelerating the benefits of being a winner much faster for certain people in certain jobs than we are for the majority of the middle class and those below in the lower quintiles, as you've already talked about. But the real impact of Chetty and Hendren's research fall within these 5 neighborhood or place-based factors that they talk about. Segregation, which has a lot to do with racial and ethnic issues. Erosion factors impacting the middle class that Regina's already talked about. School issues, quality, and they define it around SATs, dropout rates, and class sizes. Social capital. Social capital is a big driver of income and income mobility, not only in Chetty and Hendren's work, but also Putnam and others. And then family structure. There is a statement in Chetty and Hendren's literature that says family structure may be the single most salient predictor of income mobility in looking at the longitudinal possibilities down the road. Deidre Bloom in the Center for Population Studies also echoes that low income inequality more strongly, there are other factors besides low income inequality that affect income mobility. There are things like tax and government expenditure, social dynamics, federal and state policies, the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid, I mean, you've heard some of them here. There are also things on the small business side that we have to be cognizant of, things like governmental regulation, various policies that require extensive expenditures to even be in business and to sustain a profit. So this is at so many levels. But there are some serious social issues that we need to consider. Unacceptable gaps in school achievement between various groups, extremely disparate numbers of African American and non-Caucasian incarcerated at local, federal, and state jails and prisons, unsustainable expenditures in various sectors, including prisons, public safety, and health care, significant numbers of non-majority families and communities of concentrated disadvantage, poverty, we've already talked about that, an increasing number of children raised in single-family and non-married settings. I'm not making a statement about marriage, it's just the nature of family structures is changing, which means that the economics of raising children has changed dramatically in our country. So the question of the moment, does Fayetteville have more problems or challenges than any other place in the country? I think the answer is probably perhaps not. According to census data, people still move here. The population increased 10% between 1990 and 2000, although growth slowed in the last 2 years. Other than ad valorem, which are property and sales taxes, Fayetteville and county leaders have limited revenue options to try to deal with many of these social problems. And for a long time, the city of Fayetteville was limited by state statute in terms of annexation and growing revenue through ordinance. The city and county lack an integrated public infrastructure for efficient management of people issues like transportation, broader parks of recreation, healthy spaces, and managing public health care. Fayetteville is the most integrated community around. It has one of the most racially integrated metro areas defined by the Census Bureau in terms of its dissimilarity index. Fayetteville's crime rates in the past 10 years, of course, are a significant concern, although in the last year and a half they have been falling significantly. Median wages in Fayetteville are below state averages per pupil expenditures. Of course, are slightly below state average, but not statistically so. But North Carolina per pupil expenditures are substantially below the rest of the country. Okay, so what are we going to do about all this? In my last 2 minutes, we're going to solve all these problems. But I will echo what they've already said. Adjusting minimum wages or calling for government intervention to fix social mobility challenges are limiting and short-sighted strategies. They're overly simplistic and won't do it. Income inequality is accelerating, as Regina's pointed out, and that is a much bigger picture than just adjusting the minimum wage or sort of manipulating the wage scale. There is insufficient agreement as well that income inequality alone is driving negative social outcomes, and some evidence to suggest otherwise. On these other factors, income differences across racial and ethnic groups, school quality, social capital, these are things that we need to think seriously about. Fayetteville and Cumberland County have a successful history of working together. There are a number of examples I could cite, but success has been elusive over the long term. Local leaders care very much about their constituents and about the quality of life here. Elected officials tend to sacrifice a great deal in substantial ways to serve in their positions. From a criminal justice, prevention, intervention perspective, I suggest we nudge people. And if you don't know what nudging is, read Thaler and Sunstein's book on nudging, the use of behavioral strategies to affect social policy. Let's build in our fiscal and social policies proven behavioral strategies, what science and practice tell us to be cost beneficial and cost effective. And I'm a big fan of ecological models of planning and intervention that include prevention and promotion of economic, health, education, social, and environmental policies that make differences in these issues. For example, as Regina just pointed out, the Council for Strong America, you can find them on the web. Every child served by, served by a quality preschool or kindergarten program returns a lifetime benefit of savings of $26,000 per child. In California, tobacco prevention efforts in their state of $2.4 billion, that's a big state, this was all tobacco money from the tobacco settlement, returned $134 billion in healthcare savings. Communities That Care, the social development strategy, returns $5.30 for every child participating in the social development strategy. Fayetteville and Cumberland County can do this. There are 6 elements of this plan. I won't go through them because I'm out of time. But the gist of it is economic development, building social capital and collective efficacy with an eye on creating measurable infrastructure in communities of disadvantage, paying attention to healthcare and systems of healthcare, whether it's Medicaid reform or cost-beneficial health strategies, strengthening vulnerable families, and there are prevention science tools to do that in measurable and sustainable ways, cost-beneficial ways, ensuring the best and affordable preschool and educational systems, and supporting evidence-based law enforcement strategies, including focused deterrence, community policing, and environmental design strategies. These resources shift really expensive care of inmates from high-level institution into the system, down into community-based, evidence-based strategies, and they save a great deal of money, and they actually make the public much safer. This is not redistributive or socialistic policy. This is reinvested, captured savings, achieved through smarter investments in more productive, holistic, and longitudinal values and priorities. And so I will stop there because my time is up.
Okay, great. Let's go around with applause. So at this time, we have approximately 15 minutes or so for Q&A. We have Nam right here, lovely Nam over there. She will be walking around with the microphone. So if you have a question for all or any of the panelists, now would be the time to do that. So just raise your hand and Nam will give you the microphone. Okay.
Thank you. This is a question for all of you.
It's not on.
Oh, sorry? people who have lived here and lived here for a long time, and then there's sort of the military who are very transient. How much do you think this plays into any of your perspectives?
I can start with a couple things. I think the transience is one of the things that really harms our ability in the city to create durable social institutions, right? So people who come to an area and stay for a year and leave are less likely to do things like join PTAs and join neighborhood watch associations and look out for people. You know, one of the things that the South has, one of the good things that the South has, regardless of how you feel about religion, is very strong cultural institutions related to the churches in the South. But if people aren't buying into these churches because they're here for a year and gone, then it doesn't really help them become part of the community. And so I think that this lack of a cohesive community is something that is actually very detrimental. You know, I like to think about the things you need for an economy to work well. You need, it's like I wish we had a stool in here, but it's like a three-legged stool. If only one or two of the legs works, it's going to fall over. But you need a strong economy that fosters innovation. You need strong social networks to help, you know, to help people who are in need. And then you need a legal and regulatory framework to allow all of these things to come together. And I think if we don't have the social institutions in place, and I think that transience of our population really weakens the social institutions, then it doesn't matter what the rest of it is. But that having been said, I think that this two-Fayetteville story also weakens our economy. We wind up with, you know, armies, you know, an army full of men on Fort Bragg and an army full of housewives who just want something to do. And so they wind up volunteering instead of, you know, getting jobs. And if you have this you know, whole group of, you know, potential volunteers or part-time workers, what does that mean for the people who are going to be here forever, right? They're taking jobs, and not only are they taking jobs, they're forcing wages way down because they're willing to do it for practically free. They're just looking for something to do. And so I think that there's a big problem created not only on the social side, but also on the economic side. And then one final point, I'll let these guys have it to say. My assumption is that given the high level of transience, you're going to see less impetus for large external companies to come in and start businesses here, simply because the high level of turnover reduces profitability. And so when we have this, you know, everybody said we're missing this middle class, and I've said it too in my own special economist way. You know, we have that entry-level job, but that next step up simply doesn't seem to exist in BIV, or if it does, it's either it's snapped up by the military guys who are leaving, or the military wives who are looking for something to do, but it doesn't get snapped up by the people who are here, the people who need that step up to go from the poverty class to the middle class.
Any other comments on the question?
Well, again, I grew up here, and I think there's some of that that's true, but I think there's some of it that's not true about these two Fayetteville's. There, of course, in any community, a long-standing group of sort of multi-generational families who claim the community and invest in it over generations. Fayetteville's unique, of course, because the military brings a lot of folks in and out. But I got to tell you, the business community depends on that military community, on the retail and the service sector so much that I think it's an artificial conversation in many ways. It's also true, too, that a lot of the businesses and a lot of the interactions having to do with the military aren't just Fayetteville. There are a lot of high-earning, particularly military folks, who retire in Moore County, for example, or who do business in other places besides Cumberland County and Fayetteville. So you have to think about the military as not just having a unique sort of bi-directional dialogue with Fayetteville, but with the region. And I think this conversation about the economy is a regional conversation. It's not just Fayetteville, Cumberland County, but it has a lot to do with the region. These social network conversations, though, are really important. I used to do training down at the Justice Academy. I always used to ask the incoming law enforcement people, whenever you go, when you get transferred, when you moved into your house, did the 4 people around you come knock on your door and bring you a pound cake and say, hey, I'm, you know, Mr. Smith, and we welcome to the neighborhood? That rarely happens anymore. We don't invest in social relationships, whether you're from the military or from Clark's hardware store down the street. We do things differently in our community, so we've got to really think about reinvesting in a purposeful, value-driven social structure that generates this sense of community so that we get at some of this stuff and takes away that artificial divide that you're talking about.
Thank you. All right, any further questions?
It just seems to me that a lot of people that have issues with Fayetteville and the economy here have never taken a trip to Ohio or Indiana or Michigan and seen just the blight that is in so many of those places. And as someone who came from Ohio and a spouse from Pennsylvania, you can come here, you can buy a house, you can sell a house. There is more economic activity here than in many of the places that I've lived and gone to school in the past. And it seems like that gets overlooked an awful lot. And the military may in fact be a double-edged sword, but it has kept this place alive. And I tell you, Youngstown, Ohio would love to have some of that money pumped into their economy. I just think a lot of that is overlooked. And I just wonder what your response is from any of you comparing. I don't see a whole lot of people moving from Fayetteville or anywhere in North Carolina to Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Michigan. That traffic flow only seems to be going one way. Introduce me to the person that's leaving here to go there, and I think we can have a conversation.
Well, to say, I'll give you the sociological answer. I think that Malcolm Gladwell is focusing on large cities like New Orleans, and the Fayetteville metro area has become, again, one of the top 100 largest commuting zones in the United States, and he's therefore focusing on social stratification in large urban centers, which is the general trend, coupled with the shrinking of rural America, which is very, in many corners, very deeply poor, a kind of poverty that's deeper and more entrenched and encompasses a larger portion of the population. I can show you demographics of towns in rural America that have 60% poverty rates. And clearly, Fayetteville is much closer to the national average, is sort of the point that I'd like to make. So I think that talking about the American dream in Fayetteville is totally appropriate in the sense that we face many of the same exact challenges that other American cities face, including social mobility. And yeah, I think it's good to keep that in perspective and just sort of tailor our solutions to the fact that we are a military metropolis, probably the largest in the United States in terms of population.
All right, so we're getting to a point where we kind of need to wrap up. Is there any last questions, comments for our panelists before we leave for today?
I think all of you have made some really valid points, and I believe that in Fayetteville there is such a thing as wage suppression, which comes about from the things that you talked about, Matt, with respect to so many things. People have military pensions, don't have to work for the same amount of money as would be commanded in a place where you didn't have, you know, as many people that available to do quality work. So I think that keeps things down. I'm particularly interested, Robin, in what you were saying about the fact that we just need to kind of promote the opportunities and the abilities that people have. So many times, and I come from my environment is broadcasting and, you know, radio programming, and I know firsthand that people tend to always retreat to what they know versus finding out something that might be a little bit better for them. And so I think the ideas of, and what I kind of struggle with in just what I do day to day is how to promote change and promote the opportunities that people have and ways to break the eggs of stagnation that their own, personal economic lives might be at. But I appreciate the opportunity that you guys jumped on what I think is maybe Fayetteville's most important topic, and I can't thank you enough for being here today. You've given me some answers, or some places to start in what I can do, and I'm wondering what other things can happen. But a great beginning. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then,
I don't know.
here, here's one.
Yes, so on behalf of the Center for Entrepreneurship, thank you for coming. This is a trial kind of gathering that hopefully we would like to see more of, that there will be interesting issues to bring forward and discuss. And of course, thanks to everybody. I'm sure that you're appreciating that everyone was glad to join in. If you would, be sure to fill in the little sheet that you received when you came in the door, I guess, the contact sheet. So we'd like to get some feedback on this and see how this appealed, or what kinds of thoughts you have for going forward. And I think, other than that, actually I do want to mention one other thing, and that is the article, which, if you haven't read that article, it's in the August 24th edition of the New Yorker. So if you have some inclination to go and read the actual article, that's where it's located. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And